Welcome, everyone. Good evening. How are you? We're very, very pleased to have you here tonight for this important webinar. The title, of course, is Bolivia, Canada's Silent Role in the Bolivia Democratic Crisis. We'll be together for about an hour and a half. We're coming from all across Canada as well as Bolivia and internationally. And we'd actually like to just start out by getting a sense of who's in the room tonight. So we're going to start out with a tiny bit of interactivity piece. If we could please put up the poll, Ben. Can you please, if you can see the poll, you can just indicate where you're currently located in Canada, Bolivia, or elsewhere. And then also, if you could let us know how you would assess your level of knowledge about Bolivia. That could be Bolivian culture, politics, history, whatever. Do you find your knowledge is high? Do you strongly agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree? And as these sort of the poll gets in and starts happening, if you're joining us from Facebook, you won't be able to participate in the poll, but everybody who's here through Zoom can participate. So please go ahead, and in a moment we'll just share the results. While you're doing that, I'll introduce myself. I'm Gretchen Ferguson, currently Associate Director of Programs and Partnerships in Community Engagement at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. But I have been a person who worked in and with Bolivia for many, many years. I started as a volunteer cooperant in Bolivia in 2003, and so I have accompanied many people there through the various processes, social, economic, political, over the years. And I'm extremely glad to be able to come here and help to share some of this knowledge of our amazing panelists with you tonight. Also with me as a co-moderator for this evening is Gerardo Otero. Would you like to just say a quick hi, Gerardo?
Hello, how are you?
And
welcome, everybody.
Yes, Gerardo is also a Latin Americanist expert professor at Simon Fraser University. Do we have some results from the poll yet? Or should I keep going?
We do have results. Can you see them, Gretchen?
No, can you do, are you sharing the results yet? You hit share results, I think.
I actually don't see a share results, but I can read them out to you if you want.
Read them out. That would be awesome. Thank you.
Sure. 54% in Canada East, 17% in Canada Central, 1% in Canada North, 16% in Canada West, 2% in Bolivia, 10% elsewhere. In terms of level of knowledge, 18% say strongly agree that their level of knowledge of Bolivia is high, 21% say agree, 34% neutral, 20% disagree, and 8% strongly disagree.
Okay, great. So sounds like the geographical representation in Canada is pretty related to our actual numbers in these provinces. Great to have you all here, and a few people from Bolivia and elsewhere. Thank you for being here. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, as I see some people are already doing. Just as a logistical reminder, the chat will be open throughout the webinar. However, we won't actually be responding to any questions posed in the chat until the end. So our format tonight is that we will have each of the panelists present for about 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes. And then after all four have presented, we will have time for a Q&A. And the way to participate in that question and answer will be through the chat function. So feel free to put some questions in there during the time that people are speaking if you're not going to remember till the end, but we will be looking to answer them toward the end. Our format for tonight is we will be starting with Diego Pary, who is joining us from La Paz, Bolivia currently. And Diego is going to, Diego is a Bolivia Quechua indigenous leader, education, politician. He was part of the Bolivian Constitutional Assembly, creating the new Bolivian Constitution that was adopted in 2009. And he has also served as ambassador for Bolivia to the Organization of American States for 7 years, from 2011 to 2018, among many other prominent positions. So Diego will be telling us about the current dilemmas faced in Bolivia to provide us with some context, nationally speaking. Second, we will hear from Juan Tellez, who is doing community economic development work in Bolivia and Canada historically, and is currently a mayor of his hometown between Sucre and Potosí in Bolivia. And then after that, we will hear from Henry Veltmeyer, who is a senior research professor at the Universidad Autónoma de Zacatecas in Mexico, and also a professor emeritus at St. Mary's University. And last but certainly not least, we will be hearing from Kathryn Ledebur, who works currently with the Andean Information Network and has a tremendous amount of research experience related to the Andean area, as well as working in dialogue, human rights, and the impacts of the US and other internationally funded drug control efforts in Bolivia. So we have a wealth of experience and knowledge in this room to learn from. I do want to mention that we have simultaneous translation going on throughout this event. So at the bottom of your screen, if you are in the Zoom call, you should see a little picture of a globe, and you can choose on that globe off, which would mean you would hear whatever language the person is presenting in, whether it be in Spanish or English. If you understand both languages. If you pick English, you will hear always in English. You will have an interpreter for anyone speaking Spanish. And then if you pick Spanish, of course, everything will be translated into Spanish that is spoken in English. So any questions about that, just put them into the Q&A, into the chat, and some of the tech support people will help you. We do have 2 tech support people in the room as well. So if you're having any kind of technical issues, please do also just indicate to them either privately in the chat or in some other way that you need some support. And if you get bumped out, they will let you back in. So don't worry about that. So without further ado, because we don't have a lot of time together tonight, I'm going to actually just turn things right over to Diego Pary to tell us about some of the current situation in Bolivia. Thank you. Oh, Diego, sorry, you're on mute. Can you please unmute Diego? Oh, there we go.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. For me, it's to be a pleasure to be here in this webinar. Muchísimas gracias, Gretchen, Gerardo, Kathryn, Henry, Juan, Sara. Para mí es un honor y es un gusto poder participar en este webinar y agradecerles por todo el trabajo y el esfuerzo que están haciendo por conocer qué está sucediendo en Bolivia y por saber cuál es la situación de Bolivia en este momento. Pues voy a iniciar esta presentación un poco presentando a ustedes los antecedentes, presentando aquello que fue Bolivia en los últimos años y de qué manera este contexto se ha transformado en estos últimos meses. Ustedes conocerán que la historia de Bolivia siempre ha sido una historia compleja. Un país que nace en el año 1825, se declara independiente de la colonización, pues la independencia se lo construye a partir de la participación de movimientos indígenas, a partir de movimientos de sectores criollos que en ese momento se denominaba, y Bolivia se ha ido constituyendo como un estado compuesto por diversos actores, por diversos sectores en el país. En ese sentido, hemos tenido a lo largo de la historia de Bolivia, se han tenido diferentes momentos de éxito, pero también diferentes momentos complejos de fracaso. Y en ese sentido, pues se van construyendo diferentes hitos en la historia de Bolivia. Por ejemplo, cito a manera de ejemplo, en el año 1952 se da una de las grandes transformaciones en el país, donde se implementa la educación universal, se implementa el voto universal, se genera una reforma agraria para poder entregar tierras a los campesinos, porque hasta ese momento solamente había sectores privilegiados, los que en Bolivia se denominaban los hacendados, los que tenían el derecho a la tierra. A lo largo de la historia también hemos tenido momentos muy complejos para la democracia boliviana, y en ese sentido, desde el año 68, 1968, se dan los golpes de Estado en Bolivia, y recién en el año 85 es cuando se vuelve a recuperar la democracia en nuestro país. Después de la recuperación de la democracia, todavía tenemos momentos muy difíciles, donde la polarización de los sectores estaba muy visible. Un sector claramente identificado con los sectores privilegiados del país, un sector que gozaba de todos los beneficios del Estado, un sector que prácticamente manejaba el poder en Bolivia, y el sector campesino, el sector indígena, los obreros, los mineros, los sectores populares, prácticamente al margen, estaban fuera de las decisiones de Estado. En el año 2006 se da uno de los momentos más importantes en esta transformación de Bolivia. No se podría entender Bolivia si no comprendemos la llegada de Evo Morales al gobierno. La llegada de Evo Morales al gobierno no solamente es la llegada de un partido político al gobierno o es la llegada de un personaje al gobierno, sino es el arribo al Estado, el reconocimiento por parte del Estado de todo un movimiento que venía detrás de Evo Morales y otros líderes indígenas. En ese sentido, es el arribo del movimiento indígena originario campesino al gobierno, y de esa manera pues se da el gran cambio en Bolivia. En Bolivia parecía que antes del año 2005 teníamos dos Bolivias, una Bolivia de privilegios y una Bolivia de los sectores más discriminados, de los sectores más abandonados. En el año 2006 se instala, con el arribo de Evo Morales al gobierno, se instala dos procesos muy importantes. Un primer proceso que es la Asamblea Constituyente. La Asamblea Constituyente ha permitido establecer un nuevo diálogo entre todos los bolivianos y bolivianas. La Asamblea Constituyente ha permitido un reencuentro de todos los bolivianos, de manera que podamos dialogar y podamos encontrar puntos en común, y de esa manera impulsar un país unido, un país que finalmente pueda despegar y pueda ir hacia el desarrollo. El año 2005, el año 2006 se instala la Asamblea Constituyente y concluye en el año 2007, aprobándose una nueva constitución política del Estado, una constitución altamente garantista de derechos. Es una de las constituciones más avanzadas que ha construido Bolivia, y sin duda alguna que también se reconoce en diferentes partes de Latinoamérica como una de las constituciones que garantiza muchísimos derechos humanos, pero también derechos colectivos. En ese sentido, pues, es una nueva refundación de Bolivia, porque significa el reencuentro de todos los bolivianos y las bolivianas. Esta es una de las grandes transformaciones que se da en la estructura de Estado, es una de las grandes transformaciones que se da en la estructuración, en la institucionalidad democrática del Estado boliviano. Ahí es cuando se constituye el Estado plurinacional de Bolivia. La palabra plurinacionalidad no solamente significa, no solamente es un elemento que se incorpora en el nombre del país, sino tiene una profunda significancia, porque significa el reconocimiento de la diversidad cultural, el reconocimiento de la diversidad económica, de la diversidad religiosa, de todo lo diverso en el país. Es decir, a través de la plurinacionalidad podemos convivir en un país llamado Bolivia. La otra transformación muy importante en el ámbito económico, sin duda alguna, es la nacionalización de nuestros recursos naturales y las empresas estratégicas. Esta nacionalización ha significado la recuperación de los recursos que tenía Bolivia en beneficio de todos los bolivianos y las bolivianas. Y eso no significa que hayamos actuado infringiendo el derecho internacional sin garantizar el tema, la seguridad jurídica de las empresas. El Estado boliviano, el gobierno boliviano ha nacionalizado empresas, ha nacionalizado los recursos naturales de Bolivia, garantizando plenamente la devolución de las inversiones que hicieron las empresas internacionales. Hemos dado la seguridad jurídica necesaria, y aquellas grandes inversiones que se hicieron en el país, de acuerdo a las cotizaciones internacionales, se ha resuelto de manera consensuada con las diferentes empresas a nivel internacional. Esto ha permitido que el Estado boliviano pueda tener mejores ingresos y con esos ingresos se pueda prácticamente implementar diferentes programas de desarrollo, diferentes programas para mejorar las condiciones de vida de los bolivianos y las bolivianas. Hemos tenido cerca a 14 años donde el país ha tenido grandes éxitos. Bolivia en los últimos 14 años ha logrado reducir la desigualdad entre ricos y pobres se ha reducido, y así lo reconocen los diferentes organismos internacionales. También se ha reducido la extrema pobreza, y por el tiempo solamente menciono a manera de ejemplo. Bolivia en el año 2005 tenía una extrema pobreza de 38.2%. El año 2018 ha concluido con una extrema pobreza de 15.2%. En 13 años, un poco más de 13 años, se ha logrado reducir 23 puntos porcentuales de la extrema pobreza. Ningún país en el mundo ha tenido estos logros que Bolivia ha tenido. Si ustedes se fijan un poco en la historia, Bolivia siempre ha estado clasificado entre los países con bajos ingresos, entre uno de los países más pobres del continente americano. De todos los países, siempre Canadá estaba el primero, Estados Unidos, y teníamos al final de la lista, en materia de desarrollo económico y desarrollo humano, teníamos a Bolivia y finalmente a Haití. Esa era la situación constante de Bolivia. En 13 años hemos logrado cambiar esta situación. Los últimos 6 años, Bolivia ha sido uno de los países que más ha crecido en el continente americano. Bolivia ha tenido un crecimiento promedio en los últimos 6 años de 5%. Eso le ha permitido implementar y desarrollar gran infraestructura. Hemos desarrollado infraestructura educativa, infraestructura en salud, se ha desarrollado infraestructura en relación a lo que son los caminos, aeropuertos, y nos ha permitido una mayor integración al mundo y nos ha permitido conocer, relacionarnos mejor y fortalecer nuestro comercio internacional. Pero, ¿qué es lo que ha sucedido el 10 de noviembre? El 10 de noviembre en Bolivia se ha dado un golpe de Estado. Ha asumido un gobierno de facto por la fuerza. Se manejó un argumento, bueno, cabe mencionar que en Bolivia hubieron elecciones generales el 20 de octubre del año 2019. En esas elecciones ganó Evo Morales, segundo Carlos Mesa y posteriormente otros partidos. Se acusó de la realización de un fraude electoral bajo un informe manipulado, un informe direccionado por parte de la OEA. Lamentablemente, este informe contribuyó a que se consolidara el golpe de Estado en Bolivia. Un golpe de Estado promovido por sectores radicales de derecha, pero además acompañado de la policía y acompañado de las Fuerzas Armadas. Claramente nos muestran las imágenes que ustedes pueden ver en los medios de comunicación y en las redes sociales que las Fuerzas Armadas y la policía boliviana fueron los actores fundamentales para el derrocamiento de Evo Morales en el gobierno en noviembre de 2019. La OEA hizo un informe absolutamente político que no tenía ningún argumento técnico. A la fecha ya se han realizado más de 6 informes por universidades especializadas de Estados Unidos, por universidades especializadas de América Latina, donde se demuestra claramente que en Bolivia no hubo fraude. En Bolivia lo que hizo la OEA fue una manipulación de los resultados y afectó gravemente a la institucionalidad democrática. En ese contexto, solamente para ejemplificar, en Bolivia tenemos 33.555 actas de votación. La OEA observó 226 actas. De esas 226 actas solamente significan el 0.24%. Evo Morales ganó la elección con 10.57% de diferencia. Si restamos el 0.24%, Evo Morales sigue ganando la elección con más del 10%. No solamente con 100 votos, con 1000 votos, con muchísimos votos que son más del 10.57%. El 10 de noviembre se consolida el golpe de Estado, asume un gobierno de facto y hoy día Bolivia se encuentra en uno de los peores momentos en un momento de crisis económica, momento de crisis política, crisis social y acompañado de una crisis sanitaria. El país está prácticamente retornando a la crisis de hace 30, 40 años atrás, y esto nos llevará por muchísimos años a graves consecuencias, y el país está esperando tener elecciones el próximo 18 de octubre. Estamos esperando que la comunidad internacional, organismos internacionales, diferentes ONGs, personalidades a nivel internacional puedan acompañarnos en estas elecciones, porque el gobierno tiene claramente la intencionalidad de no respetar y de no reconocer los resultados que se vaya a obtener en las elecciones del 18 de octubre. Muchísimas gracias, me quedo acá por el tiempo y pues en el momento de las preguntas estamos dispuestos a poder continuar y a poder complementar algunos temas que les interese. Muchísimas gracias, Gretchen.
Thank you so much, Diego, for giving us that context, that important context. If anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat or Q&A, and we will be recording them for later on in the session. Right now, I would like to, and have the honor to turn things over to Juan Tellez, who, as many of you know, is both a Canadian and a Bolivian citizen, and currently a mayor in his hometown in Bolivia. Juan? Are you there?
I'm okay now?
Yes.
All right. Good evening then to everyone. Special regards to the panelists, my friend Diego, Henry, and Kathryn, and to the moderators, Gretchen and Gerardo, and to the organizers. Let me start with a big thank to all of you for your solidarity in this very meaningful time of ours. Your support is very important. You're probably expecting me to jump into talking about Bolivia, but as many of you know me, I want to share with you a couple of stories to reflect the parallel lines of community development work in Canada and in Bolivia. My work as mayor in Bolivia is not so different from the work I did in Canada. Back in the 90s, we organized an international gathering of people in Halifax involved in development. After days of discussions, the gathering concluded that the shortcomings of large investments in development was due to using methodologies looking at the deficits in the communities. This was the famous needs assessment approach. We realized that we needed to depart from this needs assessment approach. One of the eye-opening experiences was working with the African Nova Scotian communities, in particular with the North End and East Preston communities in the outskirts of Halifax. With the Watershed Association Development Enterprises, we had started shaping and organizing the existing resources in the community in 4 categories. The natural resources, the existing infrastructure, the generation of income, and the human resources. The identification and quantification of human resources in the African Nova Scotian communities was absolutely striking. In a community of 5,000 people, there were over 200 singers, music bands, boxers, basketball players, tailors, about 15 church choirs, women and men pastors, deacons, and above all, their human resource with an extremely rich history. We printed a big map of the community, placing the assets that the community had. This was a time to realize how proud and how rich the community was. Historically, as you know, the Black communities are criminalized by the media, but also by development agencies. And this was the time to acknowledge the richness of the community. With community mapping assets, we abandoned the development of the starts at identifying deficits. we foster the mobilization of the existing resources. This asset-based approach was the foundation of building the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, the CED network. This approach needed a national platform and a national agenda. This was the inspiration that led to organizing the national gathering of community economic development practitioners in Halifax. We expected to have at that gathering 200 participants, but we had over 600 participants from across Canada. This was the impetus to dedicate our energies in building the Community Economic Development Technical Assistance Program of setup at Carleton University. At that time, we started a Community Economic Development Certificate and Diploma program in programs in Halifax and Nova Scotia, and graduated over 500 people per year from our CED training programs in Nova Scotia. Then I want to move to my experience in Bolivia. One morning in 2009, I received a call from the Minister of Planning for Development in the government of Bolivia, who invited me to be a special advisor to the ministry to help developing the indicators of the living well paradigm. From there, I played different roles in the Bolivia's government at different levels. However, I always maintain a relationship with my community that is called Huantapita. One evening, it was a call for a general meeting, and while I was visiting my community, and the meeting started around 8 p.m. and ended up at 2 in the morning. One by one, community members spoke, women, men, youth, and elders. And at the end of the meeting, they asked me if I would accept, or if I would agree to be the candidate, their candidate to be a mayor of the Betanzos municipality. I felt overwhelmed and humbled to be asked by my community. At that time, I was doing my PhD at the University of Zacatecas in Mexico, and involved in research activities to further develop the indicators of the living well paradigm. I had then to decide whether I was prepared to make a radical rupture in my life. But the community of my birth meant so much to me that I agreed to run for mayor. Then my life was transformed. Every day is a new day with new challenges, but also with the new opportunities to make a difference. Like one morning, a poor woman came devastated and stopped me at the door, asking me why their cows were sick, as if the mayor could know that. Another day, a man came rushing from a community to propose building a water dam to irrigate 5 acres of cultivated land. Another day came a community to propose drilling a well to access drinking water for families. But one of the major initiatives we launched out of the Betanzos municipality is the Festival Nacional de la Papa, the National Potatoes Festival. Its purpose of the festival is to address issues in the production change of potatoes. This is similar to my organizing efforts in Canada. Now I'm going to tell you a bit about the potatoes in Bolivia and the significant role of it. So please bear a little bit with me. There is 650 kinds of registered potatoes in Bolivia. 650 kinds of potato that are registered. In Betanzos, we registered 79 kinds of potatoes in a year. 1.3 million tons of potatoes are produced in Bolivia in a year. 250,000 people, families, 250,000 families are involved in producing the potatoes. And if you multiply by 4, that is about 1 million people that are involved in producing potatoes. Families involved in producing potatoes in Bolivia are at the base of the triangle, the social triangle. Potatoes are cultivated in an ecological level in Bolivia of all kinds, in the highlands and in the lowlands. The production of potatoes in Bolivia has the widest ethnic diversity involved. We organized the festival for 2 years with the participation of 50 to 60 municipalities from Bolivia. In the first year, we had the participation of 15 countries, and last year we had about 24 countries. This year, we delivered a virtual symposium of 6 sessions and had from 8.5 to 10.5 thousands of people participating in the discussions of all kinds of issues around the production, commercialization, and transformation of potatoes, especially in the context of this COVID-19. We are turning the Potatoes Festival into an organizing process of the largest social force of production in Bolivia. Can you see the political purpose of that? Let me talk now a little bit about the current context, because after the Áñez government came to power, there was no money given to the municipalities in Potosí to do projects, nor to prepare and deal with the COVID-19. Out of necessity for the people, we mobilized and networked the mayors to challenge the current authoritarian government. In July this year, 41 mayors of the Potosí department we went on a hunger strike to demand the transfer of budget to municipalities, and we achieved that. At the end of July, the Andes government announced the postponement of the September 6th elections. The elections had already been postponed 3 times. Many people were concerned that the government wanted to postpone the elections to hold on to power. As historically happens in Bolivia, the people expressed their disagreements with the government's postponement of elections by blockading the roads. Betanzos had the largest road blockade in the region, with about 3,000 people risking their lives with COVID to pressure the government to have free and fair elections and to set a date for the elections that would not be changed again. It is in this context that I received a notification to appear in court and was charged for terrorism, sedition, and danger to public health. 7 other mass leaders in the province of Potosí received these same charges. Upon entering to the court, I heard the names of 10 more people from the mass leaders, the indigenous leaders, and the union leaders being charged with sedition and terrorism. In the context of this Áñez extreme right government, this was a very threatening measure. The purpose of this accusation is to intimidate leaders such as myself, to threaten leaders for participating actively in organizing for the upcoming elections to run and to return the mass government to the government. These charges make us very vulnerable. In Canada or in Bolivia, there is a call to dedicate our lives, to invest our energies, to exercise our convictions, to continuously constructing the new world with justice and equity until we reach the big day of a humanized society and a socialized humanity. In closing, I want to thank you all for your solidarity with my case. But above all, I entreat you as Canadians to put your eyes on Bolivia. This is a very important dedication for all these people who have been charged or are detained by the Áñez government. It is in your hands. It's in our hands to request that Canada does its part to ensure that Bolivia has a free and fair national elections on the 18th of October. Please let me thank my family and friends for their commitment to a world with justice, and to the moderators and fellow panelists for putting this together for all of you watching. Your actions on this are very meaningful, as they always have been. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Juan. Thank you very much. And I know that there's many people commenting in the chat that they are sending their support to you. I know that many of us feel that way, and we wish you all the best. Thank you for sharing with us. We also have questions coming in about the elections, which we will be pleased to try and address in the Q&A portion. Please do continue to put your questions into the Q&A or the chat, and we are recording them. Or if you just want to say something to Juan or the other panelists like you are doing, please do feel free to comment in the chat. We are looking at those. Next up, I would like to introduce again Henry Veltmeyer. And Henry is going to share with us some information from his research and knowledge of Canadian relations in the context of Latin American politics, and specifically related to Bolivia. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Juan, for that. And thank you, the organizers, for this important webinar. I hope it's fruitful in bringing about some change. I'm not sure what I can add to the discussion. Of course, I was prepared to prepare an hour-long paper, thinking that Juan, a former graduate student of mine, might expect it. But then I thought I'd better not, given that I only have a few minutes. So I will simply share a couple of thoughts as to how I see the Canadian government's position on Bolivia. The Trudeau government initially, that is November 14, 2019, stated that it wouldn't necessarily follow the US government's support for the unelected democratic regime of Senator Jeanine Áñez, the right-wing, overtly racist senator who had assumed power in the immediate aftermath of the coup. The government, the Canadian government that is, in the form of Global Affairs Canada and Minister of Foreign Affairs Freeland, was evidently somewhat concerned about backing a politician with a history of anti-indigenous statements. In this connection, Áñez has been quoted to say that she dreams of a Bolivia free of indigenous satanic rites. The city, she added to this quote, meaning control of the government, is not for Indians. They had better go to the highlands or El Chaco, she added. They should return to their rural communities and leave the city and the government to those who have the right and the capacity to govern. Thank God, she concluded, the Bible has returned to the Bolivian government. God has returned to the palace. And she warned voters against allowing the return of savages to power. So extremely overt racist statements such as these were somewhat disconcerting for the government, leading the government at first to hesitate in following the US and Brazil, that is Bolsonaro, in recognizing the interim president. At the same time, however, the Canadian embassy within days of the coup removed the photographic display of Evo Morales as president on their website banners, and very soon updated its position on the chaotic situation in Bolivia, saying it would work with and support Áñez's caretaker regime in moving forward quickly to elections, while stopping short of formally recognizing her presidency. In any case, it was evident from the outset that the Canadian government had accepted the pretext for Morales' overthrow, which is the audit of the OAS's electoral audit mission that found election irregularities in the first round of voting, an audit to which Canada had contributed several forensic specialists. So in other words, they were part of the audit report. Freeland's initial statement on the issue had no hint of criticism of Morales' ouster, while leaders from Argentina to Cuba, Venezuela to Mexico condemned Morales' forced resignation. And also, notwithstanding Freeland's commending the invaluable work of the OAS, the Audit Mission, disregarding published evidence that showed that this audit report was faulty, to say the least, Canada's policy toward Bolivia began to look ever more undemocratic with each passing day. To date, there's been no acknowledgement of the clear evidence summarized by Diego that the OAS audit report was faulty, or any sign of backing away from the government's tacit support of the alliance of economic elites, Christian extremists, and security forces that deposed Evo Morales. Unfortunately, Freeland's initial response as foreign minister, her failure to rally to the cry of democracy, and the government's subsequent stance on the unelected racist interim regime is of a piece with the government's anti-democratic stance on so many issues regarding Latin America, especially in respect to the OAS in Venezuela, in which the government closely toes the line of the position declared by Trump, the US government, whose democratic credentials are extremely suspect. Now, despite her parading, this is Freeland, as a committed Democrat and her successor as Minister of Foreign Affairs, they might well be an undeclared representative of the interest of Canada's mining companies in Bolivia's natural resource wealth. This includes business magnates like Elon Musk, Canadian businessman, and in fact American since 2002. And I think he's still an South African citizen. Anyway, he's the owner of Tesla, the biggest manufacturer of electrical cars in the world, who is presumed to have an interest in Bolivia's rich deposits of lithium needed to run the batteries of the cars that he plans to manufacture next year in Brazil. On the one hand, there's no evidence to support the conspiracy theory that Canadian corporate or mining interests were directly or even indirectly involved in engineering or supporting the coup. On the other hand, Monk was quoted to have jokingly said, "We or they can coup whoever they want," leading Evo himself to tweet that this is proof that Tesla and Monk were involved in a plot against him to secure access to the country's lithium deposits. As I said, there's no evidence that Monk himself was actually involved in orchestrating or participating in the ousting of Evo, or even that the government is the captive of the interest of Canadian mining companies in Bolivia's natural resource wealth. But even so, there is no question that no matter the official line of the government, it would still prefer to have an alternative to the regime, the mass regime, one that would be clearly more supportive of ventures such as the extraction of lithium and the broader economic interest of Canadian mining companies, which account for up to 70% of all the capital invested in extraction of minerals and metals in Latin America. 70% of it is controlled from on the stock market in Canada. These are Canadian companies that control in a number of key sectors, mining in Latin America. And of course, in Bolivia, you have not only lithium, but there's quite a few other resources of interest to mining companies. In terms of lithium, there are quite a few other countries, of course, that could supply the demand for it. But then there's, as I said, there's talk of Tesla building a plant in Brazil, which would be very interested in Bolivia's lithium deposits. Anyway, the reason I'm mentioning this is because this economic interest could help explain the Canadian government's lack of concern for what has happened and what is happening in Bolivia in regard to democracy, the power grab and coup and the aftermath. It's lack of support for those who were deposed, and they continue to be harassed by the political and security forces. And we have here Juan as a testament as well as a victim of that. Well over 100 mass politicians have been arrested or have been forced to flee from the law in an effort to exclude the party and oppositional forces from participating in the next elections. Now, I think set for late October after 3 postponements because supposedly of COVID. Anyway, Juan and those detained with him are the latest victims of this policy. So in the lack of concern for these developments, the Canadian's reputation as a guardian of democratic values has been seriously tarnished. It remains to be seen what actions the government will take in regard to the postponed elections upcoming late October. And more importantly, it responds to what's happening today in the harassment and worse of opponents in Bolivia. The government should intervene minimally by protesting these actions. If not supporting one of its citizens caught in the net of the security forces. Freeland and LeBlanc is Minister of Foreign Affairs, I don't know, but Freeland, unfortunately, herself is a xenophobic anti-communist, which played into her ready acceptance of the US-controlled OAS in response to the coup, and explains her anti-democratic stance then and since. So in regard to LeBlanc, I don't know what we might expect. We might have to appeal to some other members of the Liberal government, some of whom are more supportive, and also certainly the federal NDP and the Nova Scotia NDP. And I think the government has to be confronted. And I think we should demand as Canadians that it get involved in the situation and put its politics where its mouth is in terms of voicing its support for, declaring support for democracy in Bolivia and in Latin America and in Canada for that matter. Anyway, I'll end with that. That's it.
Thank you so much for your input and your thoughts and reflections, Henry. I think that was very interesting, and it's definitely generated a lot of conversation in the chat and in the Q&A, which we are recording. We're not going to be able to get to everybody's questions in the Q&A, but we're going to do our best. So next, I would very much like to turn things over to Kathryn Ledebur from the Andean Information Network, and Kathryn also will be telling us more from her work into research and activism related to human rights, particularly in Bolivia. Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you very much, Gretchen, and thank you very much to the organizers of this panel. I think it's an honor for me to be able to go at the end after such excellent and thorough presentations that give you kind of an idea of the different facets of what's going on now with Bolivia's authoritarian government, and a real silence and complacency on the part of the international community. I think that the key racial and racist elements of this group understand that one presidential candidate, Luis Fernando Camacho, closely allied with Áñez in the past, came up through a youth group which used Nazi salute formally. This is not an authoritarian government that is subtle or hidden or difficult in any way to discern. It meets all of the items on the checklist of early warning signs of authoritarianism. We have attacks on the press, you know, the second day of the Áñez administration. And remember, she appointed herself with no constitutional mandate after there was an agreement of a small group of international officials, including the European Union ambassador and others, that decided that she would be the person for the role. She has broken virtually every promise. She has exhibited racist behavior. Her ministers have stigmatized indigenous people, Pary cocoa growers, and other individuals as terrorists, as savages, as guerrillas, as groups that don't enjoy any rights. I think it's very important to note that just a few days after she took power on November 12th, 3 days later, we had the first massacre since 2003. This is in fact the worst protracted period of violence that has existed in Bolivia since the return to democracy in 1982. And I think that's very important to note that although the international community has said very little publicly, and I will call out my US government and the Canadian government very specifically, for not calling out what are blatant abuses and blatant violations of the democratic principles that both of those nations were built on. We do have elements of the mainstream press that point very clearly to strong-arm tactics that reflect similar practices that occurred in the 1970s through Plan Condor, the suppression of journalists, the consistent and expanding charges of terrorism and sedition. And in Juan's case, for example, we have no evidence at all, nor is any evidence presented. In other cases of clear violation of freedom of speech, participation in pro-mass WhatsApp group is sufficient to end up in jail without any right to parole or due process. And understand that we had this illegitimate dictatorial regime with the complacency of the United States, with the complacency of the Canadian government, who adopted to take a behind-the-scenes approach to diplomatically negotiate. You cannot take a behind-the-scenes approach with a government that has a dual discourse, that doesn't respect basic human rights, due process, the rights of indigenous people, or basic principles of democracy. To me, it is unconscionable that you have the Bolivian armed forces and the generals promoting themselves in clear violation of the Constitution. These are armed forces that ask the president to step down. This is clear evidence of a coup d'etat. This is something that needed to be called out. And I find this complacency on the part of the international community, this early silence, has meant that as things have become increasingly extreme, we aren't shooting people anymore, that they have been unwilling to backtrack or admit they were wrong into a situation where I think the governments themselves feel uncomfortable, but are not willing to admit that they made the error. Of course, I leave Trump and Mike Pompeo, the US high-ranking officials, out of this because they're very much a mirror of the Áñez government. I tell you that people with very blonde orange dyed hair and poorly combed, both Trump and Áñez, have very similar behaviors. We have a lot of fake news, attacks on journalists, a critical fundamentalist Christian focus that doesn't at all reflect values that true Christians espouse. There is a total lack of empathy, a total restriction of the rights of people that are in any way different from them, and an increase in the extreme poverty and the inequality in both nations. This exacerbated by a pandemic, and a pandemic that has seen increases in human rights violations from the Áñez government, increased corruption over key elements such as respirators, and total illegitimacy of a regime. And we see other organizations, with notable exception of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, which, by the way, lost its president when Diego Almagro refused to confirm his unanimous reappointment in an illegitimate move, as one of the key voices that had spoken out early and consistently on the violations. You have the High Commissioner of Human Rights at the United Nations, who's also spoken out. But you see the larger institutions, the OAS, playing a very biased role in electoral observation, a very biased role in terms of the way that they have dealt with this conflict, in spite of so many violations and key contradictions. And really, you see on a group of these international elites a kind of relief that they don't have to talk to union leaders or indigenous leaders or grassroots politicians or low-income people, or people with different visions anymore. And there's this return to a neo-colonial, chauvinistic, paternalist vision. We will decide what's best for you. And this is something that is not lost on the great bulk of the Bolivian population. I remember the night of the Sacaba massacre when I went out with my daughter and my team to document the violence, and we must have talked to 50 people until 4 o'clock in the morning that were victims and had witnessed the massacre. And they all said individually, we know that in one day we have lost all our rights. We don't matter to these people. They have killed us like dogs, but we know what our rights are, and we're not going to go back to the way it was before, and they're going to have to take us into account. And so I really think that this message, which is a very heartfelt message of people and people who have engaged, some wholeheartedly as Mas supporters, some as people that had a mixed view about the Mas party. But at this point in time, there's a targeting not only against all indigenous people, rural people, low-income people, people who support Mas, people who have perhaps made judicial decisions based on due process, this net of who is the enemy of the Andean government and what will most likely be a across-the-board right-wing coalition with supposed moderate Carlos Mesa is a growing wider net where women's rights, where LGBTQ rights, where rights of Afro-Bolivians are also being trampled. And it's high time that the international community and the US government and the Canadian government defend the rights of Bolivian citizens, but also defend the rights of their citizens. And I think it's important to point out to the US and the Canadian government that a Bolivian Canadian is just as important and has the same rights as a white Canadian, and that that should not be a disclaimer or something how they gauge their response. You know, Canadians' rights are the rights of all Canadians. International, universal human rights correspond to all. And it is each government's international obligation to publicly denounce violations, to support the rights of all people, and to focus on what is a genuine and inclusive democracy. And I think it's time for us as international citizens to hold our governments accountable for these omissions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. And we've been busy noting down questions and comments from people. Thank you for sharing those. And for the panelists, I really recommend that you take a moment to look in the chat, especially Juan. There are many personal messages to you in there that you might want to just take a look at. So we're at 5 o'clock, which is great. Because, 5 o'clock my time, sorry. People are at all different kinds of time, but what I mean is we have half an hour still for some discussion, which is wonderful. And so I think that we can, we've been trying to organize some of the questions and comments a bit into categories. So I will just perhaps start by posing to you a couple of the questions that we're seeing here. some of the questions are related to the role of external organizations and governments. So one participant has asked if the panelists could comment on the role of the European Union and or NATO and the media, you know, their corporate or state media, any other kinds of organization, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, that might be supporting the coup or the current government in Bolivia. So wondering about the role of EU and or NATO. That's one of the questions that you could ask. And then secondly, a little bit more about the specific role of Canada in all of this. Is there research? Is there anything concrete that we can say Canada has been doing vis-a-vis Bolivian the Bolivian political situation currently? So if we could have one or two panelists respond to those two questions. Anyone volunteer? Kathryn? Okay, wonderful, go ahead.
May I say something?
Please go ahead. Oh dear, I think Kathryn may have frozen. She is in Bolivia with a bit of technical difficulties. Let's move to Diego. Diego, ¿puedes comentar, por favor?
Muchas gracias, Gretchen. Yo creo que es importante diferenciar cada uno de los organismos internacionales y su rol que ha cumplido en este conflicto boliviano. Primero, la organización que ha contribuido al golpe de Estado es prácticamente la Organización de los Estados Americanos. La OEA ha sido uno de los actores fundamentales en el golpe de Estado al presentar un informe absolutamente falso, un informe manipulado y un informe que no tenía elementos técnicos que respalden su análisis y su auditoría. Un informe que estaba sujeta a decisiones políticas y no a decisiones técnicas, primer elemento. Y segundo, pues la Unión Europea y los diferentes organismos internacionales han intentado ayudar en este tiempo. Antes de pasar a la Unión Europea, retorno a lo de la OEA. La OEA ha sido uno de los actores fundamentales, pero a través del secretario general Luis Almagro. Yo creo que va a ser muy importante el rol que pueda jugar Canadá como país miembro de la OEA y como uno de los países más importantes en la OEA para cuestionar y para pedir que la OEA finalmente se retracte de este informe. Porque el informe que ha realizado la OEA es un informe prácticamente que ha llevado al rompimiento de la institucionalidad democrática en Bolivia. Yo creo que Canadá puede cumplir un rol muy, muy importante para pedir que la OEA prácticamente anule y deseche este informe y se pueda incluso procesar a quienes son culpables dentro de la Organización de los Estados Americanos. En este último tiempo, pues han estado acompañando varios organismos internacionales a Bolivia. Debemos dejar claramente establecido, y yo ahí agradezco la contundencia en la exposición en las exposiciones que se han realizado, principalmente de Kathryn, una exposición donde se destaca el tema del informe de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, el informe de la Alta Comisionada de Derechos Humanos, donde claramente se ve que el gobierno de facto ha utilizado a las Fuerzas Armadas, ha utilizado armas letales contra la población civil. Hay personas que han muerto por disparos de bala, 36 personas que han muerto en el país por disparos de bala entre el 10 de noviembre y el 19 de noviembre. Creo que los organismos internacionales deben investigar esta situación. Los organismos internacionales tienen que transparentar, porque las familias se merecen la verdad, las familias se merecen saber efectivamente qué es lo que ha sucedido y requieren además, pues, requieren la explicación del Estado boliviano, no solamente de un gobierno, sino del Estado, qué es lo que ha sucedido durante esos días. Y otro elemento que es muy importante, es importante que los organismos internacionales puedan hacer seguimiento y puedan exigirle al gobierno de Áñez, al al gobierno de Bolivia a que pare la persecución contra los líderes indígenas, que pare la persecución contra líderes sindicales, pare la persecución contra ex autoridades en Bolivia.
Thank you so much. I think Kathryn's back. Would you like to respond as well, Kathryn, to this question?
Yes, and I am sorry the internet got cut off. So if I'm repeating something that Diego said, please stop me. I just wanted to point out several points. One, high level of disappointment that I have in the European Union. I think the European Union has gone beyond what the Canadian government and the US government. It's important to note that for 20 years, the European Union in Bolivia had a reputation of legitimacy, of working with the grassroots. I've done a lot of work, for example, with my colleague Linda Farthing on the very important community coca control effort that the European Union has funded in conjunction with the Bolivian government, and with a very inclusive role for farmers, and that this has been a very effective coca control model. Ironically, the European Union very quickly backed the Andean government. As I said, the ambassador was one of the people that chose her. They funded a new 5-year drug strategy for an interim government and approved it, a strategy that has a just say no to drugs, repressive approach, that violates all the principles of the European Union cooperation, such as consultation, human rights, gender focus, all of the basic elements that are key principles of the European Union. They've run roughshod over that. They're negotiating at this part of time the next 7 years of cooperation to sign an agreement before an election that's in less than a month. That there has not been a focus on the interim government as a government, but it's also, it kind of points to the ego of diplomats of European countries and the US that like to be catered to. And this is certainly something that the Mas government didn't do, kowtow to diplomats, although there was a fluid rapport and a good exchange of information. I think there's consensus with international human rights organizations, and I think it's important to point out that Human Rights Watch, that has had a very conservative stance, and very vociferously criticized the Morales administration, has come out very strongly against the Áñez administration. And specifically the political persecution, for example, of the terrorism charges against Evo Morales, which they cite as fully unfounded. And that at the political persecution of Mas officials, such as Juan, as illegitimate and abusive. As they also pointed out, the same excessive use of force and the death and massacres and the death of other Bolivians that Diego has focused on in his response. Thanks.
Thank you. Gerardo is going to ask another question for some of the panelists to answer.
I'm awake. I'm staying awake.
Okay. There's a question from Dominic on whether there will be a call for international observers in the election in October. And so that's one. I'll go ahead and ask another one. And this is for Diego. ¿Qué opina usted de la gestión para afrontar el coronavirus y la corrupción del actual gobierno en Bolivia? Es demasiado genérica tal vez. Este es de Vivian Barral. Y ella misma pregunta que cuál ha sido su experiencia de Juan, experiencia concreta en el municipio de Betanzos en el tema del enfoque de desarrollo económico local. Y voy a de una vez plantear otra pregunta de Nadia Revelo, para quien la quiera contestar, sobre cuál es la situación con los indígenas de las tierras bajas actualmente. Y finalmente una pregunta de John Kirk. En inglés dice, who specifically should Canadians contact to lobby for a fair election in Bolivia and also to support Juan? I have a couple more questions, but I should stop there for now.
Quizás para responder a la pregunta de qué es lo que se ha hecho en el... Oh, sorry, I have to speak in English. I forgot that. Well, the question is what has been done in terms of community economic development approach here in Betanzos. I think the key question was always to start and to develop a strategy, a development strategy for the municipality in Betanzos, based precisely on what I have shared with you on the asset-based development approach. At the very beginning, we identify what are the existing resources upon which we should base our strategy for the 5-year government. And obviously there has been large ideas that in a number of times we share with President then Evo Morales and several ministers. And one of the key issues and the key challenges and opportunities for development here in Betanzos is how do we marry the water that we have that's going through the watershed to the Pilcomayo River and how to bring that water to increase by 60% of the irrigating land or land with irrigation for agricultural production. Does require enormous amount of resources, but we engaged ourselves in trying to match the water with the territories. We have 3 major rivers that contribute to the watershed of the Pilcomayo River. And there is about 7,000 liters per second that we flash to the Pilcomayo River. And on the other hand, we have about 20,000 square hectares of land that is not irrigated, but is cultivating lands in Betanzos. So there is a divorce between the land that's going through one way and the cultivable land is in another side. So the biggest challenge was to marry the water with the cultivating land. On that, we certainly increased. We didn't achieve the 60% of increase of irrigable land, but we came close to 30% of increasing through small projects and through some large projects of building dams and so on. But then one of the most interesting things is that, as I said before, the crop of potato is absolutely substantial in the livelihood of Betanzos families, and we increase the promotion of the native potatoes, the cultivation of native potatoes, and looking for markets and restaurants and markets to sell this native variety of potatoes. And these obviously reach to the 138 communities that are in the municipality of Betanzos. So we have projects to transform the potatoes that we produce in the municipality. But also that there is a very rich history of Betanzos. One of practically the first president of Argentina was Cornelio Saavedra, who was born a few kilometers away from Betanzos and went to live in Argentina and became one of the key leaders in the resistance to the British and so on, and became the first president of Argentina. but also Miguel Betanzos himself contributed to these large movements in the 1810 to 1815, organizing a large community-based, you would call army, but it's more a rebellious movement that contributed to the independence of the country. So we had this tremendous history and landscapes and resources to mobilize, and we apply exactly the same principles that I talked earlier, mobilizing these existing resources that are in the territory of Betanzos.
I think Diego wants to respond. Diego, let me just pose a question that came in recently. The question is, if there is any fear that we're seeing not only, oh, wait a minute. Because the question was something about, given the authoritarian nature of the current government, is there any chance that the elections in October will be fair and respected?
Primeramente, para Bolivia en este momento es muy importante el arribo de observadores internacionales. Ya nosotros hemos solicitado que los países vecinos puedan enviar parlamentarios, instituciones especializadas, puedan enviar a organizaciones no gubernamentales para que puedan acompañar todo el proceso electoral. Hasta la fecha se tiene confirmado la presencia de la Unión Europea, se tiene confirmado la presencia de algunos representantes del Parlamento Europeo, también se ha confirmado del Centro Carter que va a estar observando las elecciones, pero para nosotros es muy, muy importante porque será la única garantía, y con esto conecto a la última pregunta, será la única garantía de que la elección pueda ser transparente. Está claro que el gobierno tiene todo el interés de seguirse prorrogando en el gobierno. El gobierno no quiere dejar el poder y por ello ha postergado ya en 3 oportunidades la elección. La elección en el primer momento estaba planificado para el 3 de mayo del año 2020. No se ha realizado. Posteriormente se amplió el plazo para el 2 de agosto. Se postergó la elección. Se amplió para el 6 de septiembre. No se realizó la elección y ahora está pautada la elección para el 18 de octubre y esperemos que esta fecha se pueda cumplir, porque en este momento el país está esperando tener un gobierno que sea legítimo, un gobierno que goce de la confianza del voto popular. Todos los bolivianos y las bolivianas en este momento necesitamos certeza, necesitamos un gobierno que planifique el desarrollo por los próximos 5 o 10 años y que no solamente esté pensando en el momento, pero además necesitamos un gobierno que goce de la confianza del voto popular. En ese sentido, pues, en los últimos 10 meses, el gobierno prácticamente ha tenido un manejo desastroso de la pandemia. Es por ello que la crisis que tenemos actualmente es una crisis aberrante. Un país que estaba en los primeros lugares en crecimiento económico, hoy está en el último lugar. Eso solamente se da con un desgobierno, con un gobierno que no ha sido capaz de administrar el Estado, de administrar los recursos, además que Bolivia había logrado en reservas internacionales. Se han dado los actos más vergonzosos de corrupción. Doy un solo ejemplo y ello podrá justamente demostrar aquello que estoy diciendo. Se compraron hace 2 meses atrás 170 respiradores de España por parte del gobierno y en ello está involucrado incluso uno de los yernos de la presidenta Áñez. Se compraron respiradores que en España tienen un costo de $7,000 americanos y llegaron a Bolivia con un precio de $28,000 americanos. Eso significa un sobreprecio de $21,000. Hacer corrupción en un momento tan difícil, cuando la gente está muriendo por la enfermedad, cuando la gente está necesitando ayuda, es una vergüenza, es una de las situaciones más desastrosas que le puede pasar a un país como Bolivia. Prácticamente el gobierno no ha hecho nada en esta pandemia, la gente se ha curado como ha podido, más bien yo creo que por ayuda de la Pachamama, como se dice en Bolivia, por ayuda de los seres sobrenaturales, la población, la cantidad de muertos no ha sido tanto como sucede en otros países. La población ha acudido a la medicina tradicional, ha acudido a diferentes formas de curarse y estamos ya en un momento de bajada de la pandemia y el número de enfermos, de contagiados está bajando. El número de muertos no ha sido tan alarmante como ha sucedido en muchos otros países vecinos. Y creo que el pueblo ha superado esta crisis sanitaria, pero con ayuda del vecino, con ayuda de los médicos tradicionales, con ese compromiso que han dado los médicos, los profesionales, la gente se ha curado con aquello que le ha sido posible. Pero los actos de corrupción que se han dado durante la pandemia llegan a más de 50 denuncias que se han presentado en diferentes momentos y son los actos más vergonzosos que se han podido dar en el último tiempo en el país.
Hay una pregunta más que sería muy relevante para los canadienses, Diego. Si pudieras hablar un poco sobre tu experiencia con Canadá durante tu experiencia en la OEA. Pues tú estuviste representando a Bolivia en ese foro, entonces si pudieras comentar algo sobre la participación de Canadá.
Pues nosotros reconocemos que Canadá ha sido siempre uno de los países que ha tenido una visión amplia, una visión de avanzada en materia de derechos humanos, en materia de defensa de los sectores más vulnerables, incluso en el tema indígena. Fue uno de los países que dio un ejemplo muy importante de reconciliación nacional, de reparación a los pueblos indígenas, y creo que en ese sentido, durante mi estadía en la OEA, tuve la oportunidad de poder escuchar ese mensaje, de poder recibir ese mensaje, y creo que este es un momento donde Canadá, el gobierno de Canadá, efectivamente debe actuar. No puede permitir el gobierno de Canadá, una vez más, que se esté dando que se esté atropellando los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, los derechos de los sectores más vulnerables en un país de América como es Bolivia. Pero además tuve la oportunidad de reunirme con la anterior canciller en su momento, cuando yo también cumplía las funciones de ministro de Relaciones Exteriores, y compartíamos visiones, y pues Canadá siempre ha sido un ejemplo en materia de desarrollo, en materia de implementación de políticas en beneficio de los sectores más vulnerables, y también en materia de cooperación internacional. Y en ese marco, creo que Canadá tiene que tener una mirada mucho más precisa, una mirada mucho más atenta a lo que está pasando en Bolivia. Pareciera que pasó el conflicto de octubre-noviembre del año 2019 y los gobiernos de la región, los gobiernos que son del continente americano, han olvidado hacer seguimiento a la situación en Bolivia. Y la situación en Bolivia es complicada, la situación en Bolivia es preocupante, porque no solamente estamos hablando de un conflicto político. Este conflicto se va a trasladar por muchos años, porque prácticamente hay la intencionalidad de nuevamente someter a la mayoría por parte de una minoría. Hay la intencionalidad de someter al movimiento indígena, campesino, originario, al movimiento popular a través de diferentes estrategias. Ha crecido la discriminación, ha crecido el racismo contra los sectores más vulnerables, contra el movimiento indígena, como ya en su momento lo había, algunos se recuperaron y se mencionaron algunos términos por parte de Henry y por parte de Kathryn, llamándolos al sector indígena, al sector campesino, al movimiento popular, llamándolos de salvajes, llamándolos de gente que prácticamente no debería vivir en este país. Entonces, eso nos lleva a pensar que hay una clara intencionalidad de someter a un grupo mayoritario por grupos pequeños empoderados en el país.
Sorry. I'm just going to jump in as moderator. We do have just 5 minutes left, so I think we could ask maybe 2 more questions if we have short answers, si podemos tener respuestas breves de 1 o 2 minutos. And I think it's really important to close up with what we can do as action. There are also several questions that are coming in that are more asking about, anyway, Gerardo, I'll turn it over to you for questions.
Well, I mean, there was a question that you sent to me, I mean, somebody else has said, about, I mean, if somebody could explain, perhaps Diego or Juan or maybe Henry, why was it that, I mean, what was the legal process by which Evo Morales was able to run again in spite of the fact that there had been a referendum preventing him to do so? I mean, I understand that it was a human rights issue and some tribunal decided in favor of him being able to run again. So if somebody could touch on that briefly so that, you know, some people learn about that. Henry. Unmute your mic, Henry.
Yes, unmute, please. That will be the catchphrase for 2020, right? Your microphone is on mute.
Is it on? Okay,
yeah,
now
go ahead. Yeah, te oímos.
Okay, that last question, very important, but you have to ask Juan or Diego for that. But I just want to put in a brief comment that it's very important for us as Canadians to call out the Canadian government's lack of protests, not only of the overt racism of this current president, the violation of human and democratic rights and democratic values, but the persecution of opposition politicians and supporters. I mean, its silence on this is deafening, and it's very troubling. It's awful. And also to call out and demand that it deals with the situation of one of its citizens, Juan, which brings me to ask Juan very briefly, what is your personal situation right now? Juan?
No, thanks, Henry. Well, we were left up in the air. The day when we appear to the court, it was confiscated our telephones. I suppose for the purpose of registering or looking at who the contacts were, what conversations we had, and examine our networks and all that. I think that was the key purpose, to confiscate our telephones. But then that brings me back to the 70s and 80s, when this Departamento de Orden Político was set up by the Banzer and the military regimes. What they did is to build a list of people whenever there was a mobilization, social mobilization. They already had these lists of people so that they would go and run behind them to catch them and arrest them. I had a very personal experience in the late 70s and early 80s. As I said, they had already built up these lists based on that, and I think that was the key purpose, to confiscate our telephones so they could build these lists for persecution later on, in case that these social dynamics get a little bit deeper. But then I think many people that are involved in organizing and mobilizing and pursuing visions of transformation, those are people that are really persecuted across Bolivia, across the country. It's not just a coincidence that they are behind some of us. They know exactly who they are going behind, who are running behind. It's not a rare coincidence that they are behind us. I think the purpose is to intimidate us, to persecute us, and if they look at my telephone connections, contacts, they will clearly build up network that I work with, and through which I organize different kinds of events and different kinds of mobilization. So that made us feel extremely vulnerable because we don't know who else is going to be pulled out in this short run.
Perdón, Juan, no quiero interrumpirte, pero ya pasamos la hora y parece que la gente está saliendo del webinar. Thank you so much. People are leaving the webinar. We will be sending out a follow-up email for people who do have asked for some resources or possible actions that they can take. A lot of questions were brought up that we weren't able to get to, but I hope you found the conversation and the presentations valuable, regardless of your perspective on matters. And I can tell you from my own perspective, I deeply appreciate the experience and knowledge and expertise and commitment of all of the panel members who shared tonight. Thank you all for being here, participants, and we will be in touch. Anything else that anyone would like to say as we close up? We're just at the end of our webinar, so we do need to close it off.
Well, hasta la próxima. Chao.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias.
Solo algo breve, si me permite, Gretchen.
Diego.
No, solamente para terminar, creo que es muy importante este tipo de eventos, agradecerles muchísimo a ustedes y también no dejar de mirar la persecución que se está dando en el país. En este momento tenemos más de 9 compañeros asilados en la Embajada de México, tenemos muchos compañeros en Argentina, muchos compañeros en México, el mismo presidente Morales está en Argentina, los que estamos en Bolivia prácticamente todos estamos con procesos, con denuncias ante la Fiscalía, y creo que es importante que Canadá pueda seguir haciendo seguimiento a la persecución política que existe en este momento en el país. Agradecerles muchísimo y que sea hasta una próxima oportunidad.
Gracias.
Thank you so much. Good evening. Good night. Good night.
Maybe we should make a date for meeting again after the elections to do an assessment.
And Juan, send me an email.
Saludos, Juan.
For those who are moderators, let's just wait a few minutes.
Thank you.
Listo, Henry, te escribo.
Ok, muy bien.
Listo. Mucho gusto. Saludos. Muchas gracias, Gretchen.
Gracias todavía, Juan.
Gerardo y Sara. Y bueno, Diego, nos vemos en las próximas horas o días.
Ya.
Así es. Un abrazo.
Muy bien, chao.
Muchas gracias.